This is Dr. Kraus, and this is a short video on the topic of science in the Bible, and it's for our class BOT 101 Bible Survey for the Old Testament part of Bible Survey, and this will kind of get us prepared for our discussion concerning the book of Genesis. I love oxymorons. Oxymorons are contradictions in terms where a phrase has an inbuilt tension or contradiction if you just think about it a little bit. So some of my favorite ones are like this. Plastic glasses. Or similarly, a glass backboard. You might have to think about that a little bit. Old news, which is anathema on the internet today. We want up to the second news. A radio show being a visual word. The living dead, or steel wool. There are actually lots of oxymorons. We run into them all the time. But there is one that's been called an oxymoron that bothers me a lot. Christian Scientist. Now I know this is related to a church group called the Church of Christ Scientists, or the Christian Scientists, which are kind of quasi-Christian, not really Orthodox Christian at all. But I'm more concerned about the idea of a Christian Scientist as someone who believes in the authority of Scripture, but also wants to be engaged in science. So there's an opinion among many that there's an irreconcilable conflict between the Christian and the scientific community, between science and faith. And I just ask today, must this be? I certainly ran into this when I was in Los Angeles, and my church there was right across the street from UCLA campus, and had contact with both students and grad students and professors in very incredible high levels of scientific research. And the tone on the UCLA campus was, it was very, very difficult to be any kind of professing Christian and be engaged in science at any level. But must we ask our children to leave their faith at the door to the biology lab, or must we ask our children to leave everything they have learned in science at the door to the church? It seems to me when it comes to science in Scripture, there are three approaches. There are those who prefer Scripture over science, and so they attempt to find a type of science in Scripture, thus denying independent scientific investigation. So this approach would derive conclusions from Scripture and then go to science to see if those things can be supported, and ignore any contradictions or any tensions. There are those who prefer science over Scripture, and in this approach the assumption is that a scientific worldview makes belief in Scripture irrational and somewhat ridiculous and even embarrassing. The third approach is the one that we find probably in the evangelical community the most, and that is science versus Scripture. And what I mean by this is to compartmentalize both. So I study science in this part of my life, I study Scripture in another part of my life. I have science in one world, I have faith in another world, and I just don't let the two mix, and therefore I can live with both. I just don't think that really works in the long run, and that creates a tension and a kind of hypocrisy within us that probably is not healthy. Let me go a different direction for a minute. I want to talk about the rise of science and where it came from in our modern world. How did we get where we are? Because mankind, humankind, has not always been infatuated or controlled by a scientific worldview the way that we are right now. Beginning in the late 1600s, there was an intellectual revolution that took place that fundamentally changed the way we think in the Western world, in Europe, and by extension in America, those Europeans that were living in North America. So, to use the language of Thomas Kuhn, this was a true paradigm shift. I don't have time to go into that at all, but this change had many names. It was called the Enlightenment, or in Germany, the Aufklärung. It's interesting, the Enlightenment was kind of a French term coming from their philosophers. That means the light went on for people. Aufklärung has to do with ringing a bell. We finally heard the bell ringing. So it's sort of waking up. It's also called the scientific revolution, and really is the rise of what we consider to be the modern world. And there's some question whether or not the Enlightenment ideas still hold true today as we move into a postmodern world. But this is not the place to discuss this fully. If I teach a class in philosophy here down the road, we'll talk about this a lot more. But there are several results from this paradigm shift that are still with us today. Let me just lay out three. One, scientific method achieved supremacy and great deal of respect. So scientific method being a method of doing what we might call an experiment, where we set up a control environment and then we have a variable environment and construct a hypotheses and test it by using this methodology. Very difficult to do science in theological areas. How do you control your environment if you're talking about God? So scientific method by definition made theology a different category. But there also arose a belief, particularly in the 20th century, that technology and science were capable of solving all human problems. And so there was an expectation that in the future there would be no more hunger. All of us would be rich and prosperous. Disease would be conquered. All of these things. So for some, this rise of science meant that they had no need for God. And in a very real way, science became their God. Well, let me move off of that. We'll come back to it a little bit later. I want to talk about the nature of literature, because we're going to be looking at the book of Genesis. Literary productions are of different types, and I'll talk about this in class, but there are three primary types of literature. We have narrative. Narrative is simply the telling of a story from a narrator's point of view. So in a narrative, you've got to have a narrator, and the narrator may or may not be part of the story. You can have a first-person narrator that's one of the characters, or you can have a third-person narrator who's either a very minor character or is what we call sometimes the omniscient narrator that knows the thinking of all the characters and tells the story from a third-person viewpoint. But narrative is just telling a story from a narrator's point of view. And then we have drama or dramatic literature. Dramatic literature also tells a story, but it's telling a story using the dialogue of the characters involved. So sometimes in some drama you get a little bit of narration. You might have some type of narrator, but basically you learn what's happening based on what the characters are saying. And then the third type of literature that we have is very different and goes by different names: exposition or expository, discursive or discourse, similar ideas. In this type of literature, it's really kind of an essay or an exposition written to explore an idea or to describe something. So it's not telling a story at all in exposition or discursive writing. So the bottom line of this is that today all scientific writing is of this last category, expository or discursive writing. Other types of writing are not considered to be scientific by definition. No scientist would think of publishing his or her research results in story form as a narrative or in a poem. They're not going to do it in narration or in dramatic. So they're going to publish results in discursive writing. And so the Bible by definition, it's very difficult to see it as scientific writing. It just doesn't work. Let me say a little bit more. The tyranny of the scientific has obscured the fact that literary productions are not less important or even less true if they are narrative or dramatic. The great novelists and dramatists of our day certainly think that their chosen types of literature are ways of exploring issues of importance and truth. So the literary genres of drama and narrative actually have a much longer history than the expository or discursive type of writing, and they may reflect oral transmission and development long before there was even a commitment to writing. So keep these ideas, nature of literature, narrative, dramatic, expository. I'll come back to this again also when I try to put all this together for you. I'm going to talk though about origins because this is so important, and for a lot of people this is why they look at the book of Genesis. They want to know about origins. Humankind has long sought to understand and explain the origins of the universe in general and of humankind in particular. One of the most profound questions of philosophy is, why is there something instead of nothing? Why is there something instead of nothing? Now, when we look at origins, though, there are several clear dividing lines in the quest to understand these things. First, the difference between theistic investigation and atheistic. And this is more than simply saying there is a God or not. It has to do with one's understanding of the nature of the universe and of its physical laws. What are the physical laws that rule the universe? The atheistic viewpoint will say that everything is ultimately mechanical. There are laws that define and determine everything that happens. So we may not understand all the laws and their consequences. We may not be able to crunch all the data, but if we could, we would understand why everything happens. And this approach says we're learning more all the time. So in this way of looking at things, there really is no such thing as spirit or free will. All your thoughts and your feelings are actually chemical reactions that follow determined patterns. So that's this atheistic way of looking at things. And obviously the theistic view believes that there is some type of an entity, Christians would call God, who lives above and apart from the universe, who has power over all of these things. And so many of the explanations we search for find their answer in a divine being who is able to control and change the laws of nature and is even the author of the laws of nature. So theistic versus atheistic. But another dividing line is the evolutionist and the non-evolutionist. And I'm choosing my terms very carefully here. Evolution is the theory that human life evolved from simpler life forms and is still changing and evolving. There's lots of different kinds of evolutionary theory. I'm not going to go into detail here at all, but like the Darwinian evolution from Charles Darwin really isn't very widely accepted anymore. The scientists that believe in evolution today would say that Darwin maybe was on the right track, but he made a lot of mistakes and they know a lot better now. So the evolutionists would say that all things have happened over great periods of time, millions and even billions of years. So evolution extends to the physical world, the ultimate explanation being the Big Bang theory, but also to the animal life that we consider. Where does it come from? Well, it starts with very simple life forms and then evolves into more complex life forms. But within this group, we can put these together because we have atheistic evolutionists, and they might be preferred to be called naturalists. This is a term that you'll hear in science. The naturalist believes that evolution is the result of random physical processes that can be observed and explained in entirely materialistic and mechanistic fashion. But we also have theistic evolutionists who believe that the physical record of fossils and the results of genetic science more and more show that evolution is a process that is true, but they believe that the process was initiated and orchestrated by an outside force, and some of them would call that outside force God. Not all theistic evolutionists want to use that terminology. So those who seek to validate this position will often use arguments from the realm of intelligent design. This is where this comes in. Some of you have heard of that. Intelligent design is an attempt to show that living beings and the universe itself is impossibly complex for naturalistic explanations. But then I think we have a third category, and that would be theistic non-evolutionists. Theistic non-evolutionists believe that while there are common features among species, this is best explained not by the evolutionary process, meaning common origin moving from simple to complex and retaining earlier elements in the progression, but through some type of creation explanation by a non-created being. So we don't necessarily have a common origin so much as we have a common creator, and this explains commonality between the species. Within this group, theistic non-evolutionists, we have a category that we might call young earth creationists, who take the Bible as literal in every detail, especially in Genesis, or at least say that they do, to the degree that there is a way to mathematically count the years listed in biblical accounts. And so young earth creationists arrive at a date about 6,000 years ago when God created the universe. At this time, they would say that the universe was brought into existence in 6 24-hour, meaning day, periods, 6 days. This approach must deny and discredit any physical evidence that science might propose that contradicts their view of the Bible. So if science has some carbon dating system that shows the Earth is more than 6,000 years old, that science has to be discredited and disbelieved. But we also have a group under this theistic non-evolutionist position that might call general creationists. General creationists believe that the universe cannot be explained apart from a creator God, but they did not limit the time involved to 6,000 years or to 6 24-hour days. So these are still people who believe that God created the heavens and the earth, but are not trying to understand the Bible in a way that forces them to say that that happened exactly 6,000 years ago. Apply this just a little bit to Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3. Using the literary categories that we already mentioned, Genesis 1 and 2, the first two chapters, we would say is primarily narrative, while Genesis chapter 3 is primarily dramatic. So Genesis 1 and 2, you have a story being told by a narrator. Genesis 3, you have a story primarily being told by the dialogue of the people involved. Neither of these is expository or discursive in the modern sense of the word, and therefore, to me, it is a category error or mistake to refer to this material as scientific. So the first two chapters, narrative, Genesis 3, dramatic. It is not, it's like a category error to see Genesis then as scientific, but this does not mean that it is not true. It's very troubling to some Christians, but to ask why Genesis is not scientific is a little bit like asking why Genesis is not available on YouTube with a lot of Twitter evidence that we could put together. It's to apply a modern standard coming out of the Enlightenment to an ancient book that simply doesn't fit very well. But this does not mean that even if we were to say, and it sounds harsh, Genesis is not scientific, to our modern standards, it doesn't mean that it is not true. It is meant to be true. It even contains certain factual data. I'm not denying that at all. Genesis 1, 2, and 3 is meant to teach us about God, about his creative activity, about the first human beings, about how humankind became alienated from its creator. These are not scientific lessons in any modern sense, but they are some of the most important lessons in all of Scripture. So I just think sometimes we're fighting a battle that doesn't need to be fought, and we're trying to get answers from Genesis that it's not intended to provide. So anyway, I'll leave this here, and I'm just trying to set the scene for some of our discussion in class about the book of Genesis. So we'll finish this in class.